The bread crumbled in his weathered hands like everything else in his life. Nathaniel Collins stared at the last morsel that separated him from starvation, while the ghost of his wife's laughter echoed across the empty plains of Amarillo. 3 months since the Comanche had taken everything: Sarah's gentle smile, little Thomas's eager questions, baby Mary's innocent sleep. Now only silence remained, thick as the dust that settled on their unmarked graves. But when he saw the small figure huddled against the mesquite tree, dark hair matted with dirt and fear, his heart recognized something more powerful than revenge. The enemy's child was starving too. The morning sun painted the Texas plains in shades of copper and regret, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch all the way back to the day Nathaniel Collins lost his reason for living. He sat on the wooden steps of what had once been a home, now just 4 walls, holding nothing but memories and the persistent smell of Sarah's lavender soap. His calloused fingers turned the piece of hardtack over and over, feeling its rough edges, knowing it represented the difference between another day of breathing and the final surrender to the emptiness that had been growing inside him like a tumor. The bread was stale, probably a week old, salvaged from the bottom of his saddlebags after he'd traded his last silver dollar for ammunition he'd never used. 3 months of hunting Comanche war parties. 3 months of riding until his horse's ribs showed through its coat. 3 months of finding nothing but his own reflection in every pool of water. A man hollowed out by grief, carved empty by the kind of loss that makes the living envy the dead. The wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that reminded him of the morning Sarah had braided wildflowers into little Mary's hair, while Thomas chased grasshoppers in the tall grass behind their cabin. He closed his eyes and let the memory wash over him like a fever, remembering how Sarah had laughed when Thomas came running back with his pockets full of the green insects, his face flushed with the pure joy that only children possess. She had been hanging laundry on the line, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, humming that old hymn about walking through the valley of shadows. How prophetic those words seemed now. How cruel the irony that she had been singing about death while life still pulsed so vibrantly through their little family. The Comanche had come at dawn, silent as wolves, swift as judgment, and by the time the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the morning mist, everything Nathaniel had ever loved lay scattered across the blood-soaked earth like broken dolls. He had been checking the fence line in the far pasture, too far away to hear Sarah's screams, too far away to see Thomas try to protect his baby sister with a wooden toy sword, too far away to matter when it counted most. When he finally rode back, following the column of black smoke that rose from his burning home like a prayer to an indifferent God, he found only silence and the kind of devastation that brands itself into a man's soul with red-hot iron. The hardtack felt heavier in his hands now, weighted with the knowledge that this small piece of sustenance represented a choice: continue the hollow existence that had become his life, or simply let go and join Sarah and the children in whatever place awaited beyond the veil of this world. He had stopped praying weeks ago, stopped believing that there was any divine plan that could justify the slaughter of innocents, stopped hoping that justice would ever balance the scales of his loss. The Texas Rangers had given up the hunt, declaring the war party long gone, probably fled north into the territories where white man's law held no sway. But Nathaniel had continued riding, driven by a rage that burned hotter than the summer sun, sustained by the fantasy of finding the warriors who had destroyed his world and making them pay in blood for every tear Sarah had shed, every cry of fear that had escaped Thomas's lips, every breath that baby Mary would never take. Yet here he sat, defeated not by bullets or blades, but by the simple reality that hatred, no matter how pure and justified, could not resurrect the dead or fill the void they left behind. The sound of his own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the vast silence of the plains, a rhythmic reminder that his heart continued to beat despite his wishes to the contrary. He thought about the letter in his shirt pocket, the one from Sarah's sister in Missouri, begging him to come east and start over, to let the family help him heal from his wounds. But how could he explain that some wounds were meant to stay open, that some pain was all a man had left to prove that love had once existed in his life? The very idea of healing felt like a betrayal, as if moving forward would somehow diminish the magnitude of what he had lost, as if finding peace would be an insult to their memory. So he had stayed in this desolate place, this monument to his failure as a husband and father, surrounded by the ghosts of laughter and the echoes of a happiness that now seemed as distant and impossible as the stars that wheeled overhead each night. The hardtack crumbled slightly under the pressure of his grip, and he watched the small pieces fall to the dust between his boots, thinking how everything he touched seemed destined to turn to dust and blow away on the endless wind. The horizon shimmered with heat waves that made the distant mesas dance like mirages, and Nathaniel found himself wondering if his entire life had been nothing more than an illusion, a brief dream of contentment before the harsh awakening of reality. He had been a good man once, or so he had believed, faithful to his wife, gentle with his children, honest in his dealings with neighbors and strangers alike. He had read from the Bible every evening after supper, had led his family in prayers of gratitude for their blessings, had truly believed that righteousness would be rewarded and that God watched over those who walked in his light. But the God he had worshipped seemed to have turned his face away on that terrible morning, leaving the Collins family to face their fate alone while their patriarch chased straying cattle in a distant field. The irony was not lost on him that he had been protecting his livestock while his family was being slaughtered, that he had been a faithful steward of property while failing in his most sacred duty as protector of those he loved. The weight of that failure pressed down on him now like a physical burden, heavier than the Texas heat, more crushing than the loneliness that had become his constant companion. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of brass and amber, Nathaniel Collins sat with his last piece of bread and contemplated the mathematics of survival, how many hours this meager sustenance might buy him, how many more sunsets he would have to endure before his body finally surrendered to the inevitable. The calculation seemed both urgent and pointless, a final accounting for a life that had already ended in all the ways that mattered, leaving only the stubborn persistence of flesh and bone to mark time until the last page of his story could finally be written. The movement in his peripheral vision was so slight that at first Nathaniel thought it might be a jackrabbit or perhaps a tumbleweed caught against the base of the old mesquite tree that stood like a gnarled sentinel 50 yards from his cabin. But something about the stillness that followed made him look more carefully, squinting against the glare of the afternoon sun, until his eyes focused on what appeared to be a small bundle of rags huddled in the meager shade of the thorny branches. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip, a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing in the months since the attack, but as he watched, the bundle shifted again, and he caught a glimpse of dark hair, and the pale oval of a child's face turned toward him with the wariness of a wild animal. The sight hit him like a physical blow, not because of any immediate threat, but because of the terrible recognition that bloomed in his chest. This was a Comanche child, alone and obviously starving, probably no older than Thomas had been when the war party had swept down upon their homestead, like a plague of locusts. The irony was so sharp, it cut through his numbness like a blade, leaving him raw and bleeding inside as he stared at this living reminder of everything he had lost. The child, he could see now that it was a girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, watched him with eyes that held the same hollow desperation he saw in his own reflection each morning when he forced himself to shave with hands that shook from hunger and grief. Her clothes were little more than tattered remnants of what had once been a simple dress, now stained with dirt and torn by thorns, hanging loose on a frame that spoke of weeks without adequate food. There were scratches on her arms and legs, some fresh and some healing, evidence of a hard journey through unforgiving country, and her feet were bare and cut from walking across the rocky terrain that stretched endlessly in all directions. She made no sound, no plea for help or mercy, but simply watched him with the patient resignation of someone who had already accepted that death might be the only escape from suffering. The sight of her stirred something in Nathaniel that he had thought was dead forever, a flicker of the protective instinct that had once made him check on his children every night before sleep, that had driven him to work from dawn to dusk to provide for his family's needs and wants. But even as compassion began to stir in the ashes of his heart, another voice rose up to challenge it, the voice of rage that had sustained him through the long months of hunting, the voice that whispered of justice and blood debt and the sacred duty to avenge the innocent. This child belonged to the people who had murdered his family, who had shown no mercy to Sarah as she begged for her children's lives, who had cut down Thomas even as he tried to shield baby Mary with his small body. The Comanche had taken everything from him without hesitation or remorse, had left him to discover the butchered remains of his world and live with the knowledge that he had failed in his most fundamental obligation as a man. Why should he show mercy to one of their own when they had shown none to his? The hardtack in his hand seemed to grow heavier as these thoughts warred within him, the simple piece of bread becoming a symbol of choice that would define not just his immediate future, but the very essence of who he would be in whatever time remained to him. He could eat it himself and let the child starve, could turn his back on her suffering as her people had turned their backs on his family's pleas for mercy. Yet as he watched her, noting the way she tried to make herself smaller against the tree trunk, the way her eyes never left his face despite her obvious fear, Nathaniel found himself remembering not the morning of the attack, but the evening before it, when he had tucked Thomas into bed and listened to the boy's prayers. His son had asked God to bless not just his family, but also the Indians who sometimes passed through their territory, because, as Thomas had explained with the simple wisdom of childhood, they must be hungry and far from home too, Papa. Sarah had smiled at their son's compassion, had kissed his forehead and whispered that God loved all his children, even those who seemed different or frightening. The memory was like a knife twisting in an old wound, but it also carried with it the echo of the man he had once been, the man who had tried to live by principles of mercy and forgiveness, who had believed that love was stronger than hate and that grace could triumph over vengeance. That man seemed like a stranger now, buried beneath months of grief and rage, but perhaps some small part of him still existed, waiting to be called back to life by an act of radical compassion. The child's lips were cracked and pale, her breathing shallow and labored, in the way that spoke of dehydration and exhaustion pushed beyond all reasonable limits. She had probably been walking for days, maybe weeks, following some instinct or half-remembered direction toward water or shelter, or the slim hope of finding someone who might show her kindness. The fact that she had ended up here at the homestead of a man whose family had been killed by her people seemed like either the cruelest of coincidences or perhaps something approaching divine intervention. Though Nathaniel was no longer sure he believed in a God who would orchestrate such painful ironies. He thought about the war party that had destroyed his life, wondered if this child's parents had been among the warriors who had painted their faces for battle and ridden out to raid the scattered settlements of white farmers and ranchers. Perhaps her father had been the one to strike down Thomas, or her mother had been among the women who had helped plan the attack, who had known that children would die and had accepted it as the price of war. The possibility should have filled him with renewed hatred, should have made it easy to turn away and let justice take its natural course. But looking at her now, seeing the way she clutched a small bundle to her chest, probably the last remnant of whatever life she had known before finding herself alone in this vast wilderness, Nathaniel could not summon the rage that had been his constant companion for so long. Instead, he felt only a bone-deep weariness, a recognition that hatred was a burden too heavy for any man to carry indefinitely, and that perhaps the time had come to set it down and see what remained of his soul when the weight was lifted. The hardtack felt warm in his palm, warmed by his own body heat and the relentless Texas sun, and he realized that this moment would define him more completely than any other choice he had ever made. He could feed his enemy's child with his last bread, could choose mercy over justice and compassion over vengeance, or he could let her die and preserve the purity of his grief, the righteousness of his anger, the terrible clarity of his loss. The decision seemed to hover in the air between them like heat shimmer, visible but intangible, waiting for him to reach out and grasp whatever future he was brave enough to claim. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind through the mesquite branches and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. And in that silence, Nathaniel Collins felt the last walls around his heart begin to crack, letting in a light he had thought was extinguished forever. The morning sun painted the horizon in shades of amber and gold, but Nathaniel saw only the grey dust settling on his worn boots as he walked toward the small creek that meandered through his property like a silver thread through weathered leather. Kaya followed 3 steps behind, her bare feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth, her dark eyes watching his every movement with the wariness of a wild creature learning to trust. The silence between them was not uncomfortable now, but rather like the quiet that settles over the prairie just before dawn, full of possibility and unspoken understanding. He had given her his last piece of bread the night before, and something in that simple act had shifted the very foundation of his world, like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples outward in ever-widening circles. The hatred that had burned in his chest for so long felt different now, not extinguished but transformed, like a fire that had consumed all its fuel and now glowed with a different kind of heat. As they reached the creek's edge, Nathaniel knelt and cupped the cool water in his hands, drinking deeply, and when he looked up, he saw Kaya doing the same, her small hands mimicking his movements with unconscious grace. The day stretched before them like an unwritten page, and Nathaniel found himself thinking not of the past, but of the immediate needs that pressed upon them both. His stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar companion these past months. But now he felt the weight of responsibility for another life, small and fragile as it was. He had no more bread, no supplies in his cabin, save for a handful of beans and some coffee grounds that had seen better days. But the creek ran clear and cold, and he remembered his father teaching him to catch fish with nothing but patience and cunning. Kaya watched as he fashioned a simple trap from willow branches, her eyes bright with curiosity, and when he gestured for her to help, she moved forward without hesitation, her small fingers surprisingly deft as she wove the thin branches together. They worked in companionable silence, the sun climbing higher in the sky, and Nathaniel felt something he had not experienced in months, the simple pleasure of shared purpose, of 2 souls working toward a common goal. When the trap was finished, they placed it carefully in the shallow water where minnows darted like silver coins and settled back to wait, the prairie wind carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the movement of shadows across the ground and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface of the creek. Kaya had curled up in the shade of a cottonwood tree, her breathing deep and even in sleep, and Nathaniel found himself studying her face, seeing not the enemy he had expected, but simply a child, vulnerable and alone in a world that had shown her little kindness. Her dark hair fell across her cheek like a curtain, and in sleep, the wariness that marked her waking hours had melted away, leaving only innocence and the soft vulnerability of youth. He thought of his own children, of how they had looked in sleep and felt the familiar stab of grief, but it was different now, tempered by something else, something that felt almost like hope. The trap in the creek remained empty, but Nathaniel felt no frustration, only a strange sense of peace that he had not known since the day his world had ended in smoke and screams. When Kaya stirred and opened her eyes, blinking in the afternoon light, he smiled at her, and she smiled back, a tentative expression that transformed her entire face and made her look even younger than her 8 years. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Nathaniel made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and certainty. He would take Kaya to town, to Amarillo, where there might be people who could help her, who could give her the life she deserved, far from the violence and hatred that had marked both their people's interactions for so long. The thought of parting with her brought an unexpected pang of loss, but he pushed it aside, knowing that his own needs were less important than her future, her chance at something better than the harsh existence of the frontier. He explained his plan to her in the mixture of English and gestures they had developed, and saw understanding dawn in her dark eyes, followed by something that might have been fear or sadness. He could not tell which. She nodded solemnly, as if accepting a burden too heavy for her small shoulders, and Nathaniel felt his heart clench with an emotion he could not name. They gathered their few belongings as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and Nathaniel looked back at his cabin one last time, knowing that when he returned, if he returned, he would be a different man than the one who had lived there in solitude and grief. The night was clear and cold, with a wind that carried the promise of winter in its bite, and they made their bed beneath the open sky, sharing the single blanket Nathaniel had brought from the cabin. Kaya lay close beside him, not touching but near enough that he could hear her breathing, steady and trusting in the darkness, and he marveled at how quickly she had learned to feel safe with him, this man who should have been her enemy. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and Nathaniel found himself thinking of the stories his grandmother had told him as a child, tales of redemption and second chances, of how even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. He had not believed in such things for a long time, had thought them the foolish dreams of people who had never faced real loss, real pain. But now, lying beneath the vast Texas sky, with this small girl sleeping trustingly beside him, he began to wonder if perhaps there was truth in those old stories after all. The wind whispered through the grass around them, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain, and Nathaniel closed his eyes and let himself hope, for the first time in months, that tomorrow might bring something other than sorrow and regret. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm against the rutted road, each turn marking another mile toward Amarillo and whatever uncertain future awaited them there, while Nathaniel guided his old mare with gentle hands and a heart heavy with emotions he could not fully understand. Kaya sat beside him on the wooden seat, her small frame wrapped in his spare coat, which hung on her like a tent but provided warmth against the morning chill that rose from the prairie, like the breath of sleeping giants. They had been traveling since before dawn, when the sky was still dark and the stars hung like scattered diamonds against black velvet, and now the sun climbed steadily toward its zenith, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and green that stretched to the horizon and beyond. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer the tense wariness of strangers, but the easy quiet of companions who had learned to communicate without words, through glances and gestures, and the simple presence of shared experience. Nathaniel found himself stealing glances at the child beside him, marveling at her resilience, her ability to find wonder in the simple things. A hawk circling overhead, a prairie dog standing sentinel beside its burrow, the way the wind made patterns in the tall grass that rippled like waves on an endless sea. The road to Amarillo was well-traveled but rough, carved by countless wagon wheels and horse hooves into deep ruts that jarred the bones and tested the patience of even the most experienced travelers. But Nathaniel had made this journey many times before, in happier days when his wife had sat beside him and his children had laughed in the wagon bed behind them. The memories came unbidden, sharp and clear as broken glass, but they no longer cut as deeply as they once had. tempered now by the presence of this small girl who had somehow begun to heal wounds he had thought would never close. He remembered the last time he had made this trip, months ago, when grief and rage had driven him to seek supplies and perhaps some human contact to break the terrible isolation of his sorrow. But he had found only empty conversations and pitying looks that made him feel more alone than ever. This time was different, though he could not say exactly why, only that the weight in his chest felt lighter, the future less like a burden to be endured and more like a path to be walked, one step at a time, with purpose and perhaps even hope. As the morning wore on, they passed other travelers, a family heading west in a covered wagon loaded with all their worldly possessions, their faces set with the determination of those seeking a new life in an unforgiving land. A group of cowboys driving a small herd of cattle toward market, their voices carrying across the prairie as they called to their animals and each other. A lone rider heading east, his horse moving at an easy lope, his hat pulled low against the sun. Each encounter brought a moment of tension, as Nathaniel wondered how these strangers would react to the sight of a white man traveling with a Comanche child, but most simply nodded in greeting and continued on their way, too focused on their own journeys to pay much attention to his. Kaya watched these encounters with wide eyes, her small hand sometimes reaching out to touch his arm when a stranger approached, seeking reassurance that he could give with a gentle smile or a quiet word. He began to understand that she was learning to trust not just him, but the world itself, slowly and carefully, like a wild animal venturing into the light after hiding in darkness for too long. The sun reached its peak and began its slow descent toward the western horizon when they finally saw the buildings of Amarillo rising from the prairie like a mirage made real. The wooden structures and dusty streets a welcome sight after hours of endless grassland and open sky. Nathaniel felt his stomach tighten with nervousness as they approached the outskirts of town, knowing that the easy companionship he and Kaya had found on the trail would soon be tested by the reactions of others, by the prejudices and fears that ran deep in frontier communities, where violence between whites and Indians was a constant threat. He had no clear plan beyond finding someone who could help the child, perhaps the preacher or the schoolteacher, someone with a kind heart and the resources to give her the life she deserved. But as they rolled down the main street past the saloon and the general store and the small church with its simple wooden cross, he found himself reluctant to stop, reluctant to break the spell that had settled over them during their journey. Kaya pressed closer to his side as curious faces turned to watch their passage, her trust in him evident in the way she sought his protection, and Nathaniel felt a fierce surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. The town was busier than he had expected, with people going about their daily business, loading wagons and tending horses, and conducting the 1,000 small transactions that kept a frontier community alive. But their arrival did not go unnoticed. He saw heads turn and conversations pause as people took in the unusual sight of a grizzled rancher traveling with a Comanche child, and he could almost feel the weight of their stares, the questions forming in their minds, the judgments being made without knowledge or understanding. Kaya seemed to sense the change in atmosphere as well, her small body tensing beside him, her dark eyes darting from face to face with the wariness of prey surrounded by predators, and Nathaniel reached over to place a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could. He guided the wagon toward the church, thinking that perhaps the preacher would be more understanding than most, more willing to see past the color of her skin to the child beneath. But as they drew closer, he saw a group of men gathered on the steps, their faces hard and their voices raised in animated discussion, and something in their manner made him hesitate, made him wonder if this had been a mistake after all. The afternoon light slanted golden across the dusty street as Nathaniel brought the wagon to a stop in front of the church, the wooden wheels settling into the familiar ruts worn by countless other vehicles, while around them The normal sounds of the town continued. The ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith shop, the lowing of cattle in the pens behind the stockyards, the distant laughter of children playing in the schoolyard. But there was tension in the air as well, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up and his hand move instinctively toward the rifle that lay across his knees, though he could not say exactly what had triggered his unease. The men on the church steps had noticed their arrival, their conversation dying away as they turned to stare, and Nathaniel saw something in their faces that made his blood run cold. Not just curiosity or surprise, but anger. The kind of hard, implacable rage that he recognized because he had carried it himself for so long. One of them, a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, stepped forward and began walking toward the wagon, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, and Nathaniel knew with sudden, terrible certainty that their journey to find help for Kaya was about to become something else entirely. Something that might end in violence and blood and the destruction of the fragile trust they had built between them. The afternoon stretched endlessly before them, like a canvas waiting to be painted with the colors of their shared future, and Nathaniel found himself standing at the crossroads of his own soul. The letter from the territorial marshal lay crumpled in his pocket, its words offering a bounty for any Comanche child returned to the authorities. But the weight of that paper felt heavier than all the gold in Texas as he watched Kaya tend to the small garden behind his cabin. She moved among the struggling plants with a grace that spoke of ancient knowledge, her small hands coaxing life from the stubborn earth in ways that reminded Nathaniel of his wife's gentle touch with their own garden years ago. The sight should have brought pain, but instead it filled him with wonder at how healing could come from the most unexpected sources, like water springing from desert rock. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the peaceful afternoon, like thunder breaking over the plains, and Nathaniel's hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against the cabin wall. 3 riders emerged from the heat shimmer on the horizon, their badges glinting in the harsh sunlight like the eyes of predators who had caught the scent of their prey. The territorial marshal and his deputies had come calling, and Nathaniel felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a mantle he had never asked to wear. Kaya looked up from the garden, her dark eyes meeting his across the dusty yard, and in that moment of silent communication, Nathaniel saw not the face of his enemy's child, but the trusting gaze of innocence that had chosen to believe in his goodness. The choice before him was simple, yet profound. Surrender her to a system that would see her as nothing more than a savage to be civilized, or stand between her and a world that had already taken too much from both of them. As the marshal dismounted and approached with the swagger of a man accustomed to having his authority unquestioned, Nathaniel stepped forward to meet him, his body forming a protective barrier between the lawman and the child who had become more precious to him than his own life. The words that came from his lips surprised even him with their quiet strength. "She's my daughter now, Marshal, and she's staying right here where she belongs." The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive, the marshal's threats and legal arguments crashing against Nathaniel's resolve like waves against an unyielding cliff. And when the dust settled and the riders had departed empty-handed, Nathaniel knew he had finally chosen to stand on the side of hope rather than despair, of love rather than hate, and that choice had made him whole again in a way he had thought impossible.